Hi, everybody. This is Sue Ann from the State Unit on Aging. Welcome to our 2017 ADRC webinar series. I hope you can understand me okay. I got a little bit of a cough, as does one of our presenters, so you may hear a little coughing in the background this morning, or this afternoon, sorry. But just ignore it. We'll do our best to keep it off the recording. We're really excited about this webinar. I want to make sure that everybody remembers we do keep you guys muted because of the background noise, and we do ask you to text chat your questions in. They've built in about 3 pauses in their presentation, so text chat your questions in at any point, but we're only going to answer them at about 3 different times during the presentation. But go ahead and send your questions in as you think of them. If any of you have a group site, please text chat in who else is at your group site so we can make sure we get their attendance registered. What else? We did send out materials. We didn't get them out till this morning, but if you didn't get the PowerPoint, shoot an email to Lori Watt, Lori.c.watt, W-A-T-T, at state.or.us. And just in the subject line, say PowerPoint for webinar, and she will send you the PowerPoint for the webinar if you registered late and didn't get it this morning. Also, if you watch for an email shortly after the webinar is over, it will be a SurveyMonkey link so you can let us know how we did today, you know, how the presenters did, whether the material was relevant for you, which we hope it will be, and whether there were any technical issues. So also, please, you know, send us a text chat if you're having trouble hearing us, or shoot me an email or something. I'll keep an eye on my phone. We also have Christy Murphy in here with us today, so there'll be a couple of us that you may hear asking questions or jumping in. We're very excited today. I have with me here Shael Reuter, who is the Bilingual Education and Outreach Specialist at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, and Diane Hess, who is the Education and Outreach Director of the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. So I'm going to turn it over to them, and we are going to move on with their information. We're very excited to have them, thanks to Christy, who made the connection. Thank you so much, and we are very excited to be here. We are excited knowing that folks are participating from all around the state. We are a nonprofit organization based in Portland. We do travel around the state, and there may be times where we can do a training for your staff in your community. So if you're interested, you can contact us about that. But we are, again, very excited to have the opportunity to reach folks from so many different areas today. Again, we're a nonprofit, and our focus is fair housing law, federal and state and local fair housing law. And are we able to... Can we minimize the thing on the right? I don't have, otherwise I'll need that. I'm sorry, just one moment, please. So basically, we deal with federal, state, and in some cases local laws that address civil rights in housing. So just like there's civil rights in employment and public accommodations, same thing in housing, particularly rental housing, but all housing. And this is different from Oregon state landlord-tenant law. And I know a lot of you have clients who run into issues with housing providers, such as landlords. And I'm sorry, just one moment. Excuse me, the screen went out. So I am now working off paper. So this is different from Oregon state landlord-tenant law. So as you know, for example, a landlord has to keep people with working heaters, a big issue this time of year. So we might get a call on our hotline that says, everybody is freezing in this building, we don't have heat. Well, that would be an Oregon landlord-tenant law issue. We'd refer them to Legal Aid Services or Oregon Law Center, and you all have branches throughout the state. But let's say someone says to us, well, we have several immigrant or refugee tenants, they're not getting their heaters fixed. It sounds like they might be being treated differently because of their ethnicity, their national origin. Or perhaps we get a call from a woman who says, I have a disability, a lot of special needs. I've had to go to my landlord to request a number of accommodations, and now I'm not getting my heater fixed. I think my landlord wants me to move. It may be in that situation she's being treated because of her disability. So These are very strong protections, these civil rights protections, but to be honest with you all, one of the reasons we were so excited to do this is 1 in every 10 acts of illegal housing discrimination are ever reported. A lot of folks don't know their rights. You see a lot of people. And so our objective today is to let you know where there's a red flag. So if you're working with someone, assisting someone, you hear about an issue and you think, you know, that sounds like it might be a housing discrimination, a fair housing issue, we want to hear from them or hear from you. And we'll talk a little bit, obviously, about what those red flags are and then what we can do to assist. And my clicker is not, I'm having some, sorry. There we go. Thank you for your patience out there. So under federal law, all of us are protected from illegal discrimination because of our race or our color or the country we're from or the fact that our parents or grandparents are from another country or because we're Native American, because of our religion, because we're male or female. Under gender protection, one of the things we deal with is sexual harassment in housing, and that falls under fair housing law. It's illegal to discriminate against families with kids, and about 50% of the calls we get on our discrimination hotline, of the cases we deal with, have to do with folks who have disabilities. And so we're really going to zero in on that today. We know a lot of the people you work with are dealing with physical, mental, emotional, developmental disabilities, and fair housing laws can be a really strong tool in assisting them. So this is all federal law, and then the state of Oregon has added some additional protections. Marital status is being one. We don't hear about that too much. One I want to bring to your attention is a source of income protection. So landlords can say you need to have this much income in order to live in our rental. They might say your income needs to be 2 or 3 times the rent, for example. Or if it's subsidized housing, they might say the income needs to be below a certain amount. They can do that. They need to be consistent with everyone and have the same criteria. What they cannot do is refuse to rent someone because of the type of income they have, assuming it's legal income. So if they say, well, we're only interested in renting to someone who is employed, not someone on TANF or SSI or SSD or any public assistance program, that's illegal. Or unemployment insurance. It's illegal for them to say we will not take Section 8 housing choice vouchers. So if you see an ad in the paper that says no Section 8, no HUD, that is just as illegal as saying whites only. We have heard of landlords where they'll refuse to pay an agency rent check. And, you know, DHS sometimes is paying the rent for someone, or community action agencies or other social service agencies. So if they say we're not going to take the check from an agency, that is probably illegal. The only exception would be if that agency has bounced checks or there's been, you know, some problem like that. So source of income discrimination is illegal. Now, one of the challenges is there are professional property managers who have at least had some training on this, but to become a landlord, when you purchase rental property, at this point in Oregon, there's no requirement that you have any training at all. So we could have landlords saying Christians only, or I won't rent to people with disability, or I won't take checks from DHS because they simply don't know. One of the things we will chat with you about is, you know, we can be the hard cop, you can be the soft cop. We do have a booklet we put out for landlords that we can get to your offices for you to give to landlords and say, golly gee, I went to this webinar and we found out if you're doing that, that's a violation of federal or state law. So keep that in mind. Sexual orientation, gender identity, illegal in Oregon to discriminate on those bases. There are some folks on this call from places like Salem, Eugene, Portland metro area where there's some additional protections. They don't come up that often, but they are occupation and age over 18. So as time goes on, these protections keep expanding. Organizations like ours work with a number of other parties to make sure these laws are enforced and people are protected. So one of the baselines is that landlords or any housing providers, assisted living facilities, HOAs, and so on, need to treat everyone equally, consistently. So when they're dealing with applicants, they should be checking the same criteria for all of the applicants, their rental history, criminal history, which must be reasonable, and we'll go into that in a bit, credit history, how much money they have. But they need to use the same criteria for everyone. When the landlords are reviewing those applications, they should be going in chronological order. And if they're ever going to make exceptions to their criteria, they should have a policy. So, for example, some landlords, and this is a good thing, will make exceptions in their criteria for folks who have graduated from tenant education programs like Rent Well or Ready to Rent or Second Chance or Moving Forward, and that's fine, but they just need to have a policy saying when they will do that. So they need to treat applicants consistently. We hear far more on our hotline, be hungry, on our hotline from tenants who believe they're being treated differently from their neighbors. So violations of the rental agreement. You know, if people don't pay the rent on time, disturb the neighbors, damage the property, use illegal drugs or whatever, the landlords should not play favorites. The same consequences for anyone who violates the lease agreement, the rental agreement. And again, they need to be consistent, and unless they have a policy for making exceptions to those rules, they shouldn't be doing that. So these laws apply to all dwellings. And so whether you're working with someone who lives in a rental house or an apartment, no matter how many units, these federal, state, and local discrimination laws apply. Condos and floating homes, you probably aren't dealing with too many of those. Mobile and manufactured home parks, we do see a lot of issues in these communities. Retirement housing, assisted living facilities, adult foster care homes, really all dwellings, anywhere where people are living. Homeless shelters, transitional housing programs. Agencies that run rent assistance programs can't discriminate. Some agencies voucher people into motels, and if that motel is their only address, they're not there on vacation, all of these housing laws apply. So consistently to all dwellings. So just like these laws apply to all dwellings, who has to follow these non-discrimination, fair housing, civil rights laws is everyone. So there is liability across the board. So if someone is living in a rental and the maintenance staff is making fun of them because of their disability or sexually harassing them or anything like that, the maintenance staff person is liable as an individual. The property management company, if there is one, is liable. The owner is liable. So landlords, property management companies, they all have a legal responsibility to make sure everyone there knows about fair housing. And we're obviously talking rentals today, but again, shelters, rent assistance programs, homeowners associations, real estate, lenders and insurers, all of these we cover, although we're focusing for our purposes on renters today. Also, neighbors can file fair housing complaint if they have a neighbor, like we heard of a situation where somebody lived in a house and every day when their kids left for school, the neighbors yelled at the kids and called them names because they were from the Middle East, all kinds of derogatory terms, traumatizing the children. That's a fair housing violation. So really everybody is supposed to be complying with these. So from the first time someone inquires about a vacancy, through the application process, through the tenancy, through getting deposits back, the whole time these laws are in play. Obviously, it's illegal to refuse to rent, sell or finance to someone, to say, I'm not going to rent to you because you're white, or we don't take kids here, or we don't rent to people with mental disabilities here. Any of these things, clearly illegal. Giving out false information. This one is more common, where somebody might call on the phone and ask about a vacancy, and they're told, oh yes, there's 3 units available. They show up a couple of hours later and they're told, I'm terribly sorry, those have all been rented. And then they may call us and say, well, I showed up with my wife who is wearing a headscarf, hijab, or my wife who's of a different race, or I have a disability and I showed up with my assistance animal for my disability, and I'm wondering if I'm being turned down for this reason. One of the things we do at the Fair Housing Council is we send out secret shoppers. We call them testers. And if any of you are potentially interested in doing this in your spare time, if you have any, it's something you could think about. We don't try to trap or trick landlords, but, you know, let's say the white couple shows up and is told, yes, let's take a look at those 3 units, and the mixed race couple is told, sorry, they're all rented. Linguistic profiling. Sometimes we find out that people with accents aren't even getting calls back. Steering, where a landlord, quote, steers someone to another complex based on protected class. So this isn't a good place for families with kids. I don't think you'd fit in here for whatever reason. Or steering within a complex. We would put all the people like you in Building C. And we also monitor ads in newspapers and on Craigslist. So if there is an ad that, whether it's obvious or more subtle, where they're clearly showing a preference for a certain group and not protected classes, that's also illegal. But this is dealing with applicants, and again, we hear far more from people who believe they are treated differently from their neighbors. So same rules for everyone, same consequences for violating the rental agreement. Again, if someone is harassing, insulting someone because of their disability, because of their gender identity, any of these kinds of things, that's a violation. People are allowed to have guests. We've had situations, for example, where someone who comes to visit with their assistance animal, and the visitor is told they can't come anymore. So that's all illegal. In Oregon, there is a no-cause eviction, but such an eviction is illegal if it can be proven that the real reason for it was discriminatory. And if people have been discriminated against, they do have the right to file a civil rights complaint, which is one of the things we can help them with. We're actually proud to say that about 70% of the calls we get, of the cases we deal with, we're able to resolve informally by contacting the landlord, letting them know you can't do this, which is really what everyone wants. But that's not always the case. And sometimes someone may file a civil rights complaint. We'll assist with that. It is illegal then for the landlord to retaliate against them, to give them a no-cause notice, or not do repairs, or harass them, or anything like that is another illegal act. Harassing, intimidating, threatening, coercing, all illegal, and that is unfortunately increasing right now. People have civil rights protections in housing, just like they do everywhere else. One of the things we've run into is sexual harassment in rental housing, and there was just something in the paper last week about a landlord. I think he was what do I remember? It was 73, and I think there were 8 women he had sexually harassed. So this could be, if you don't ever have sex with me, I'll evict you, or I know you're having financial problems, or I'm going to peep in your window, or whatever. And significant, thinking of the folks in on this call, is what can happen in these situations is where they target, not always women, but in many examples women, who they think are vulnerable. She doesn't speak English very well. She doesn't have financial options. She has a mental or developmental disability, so who's going to listen to her? So that's one of the things we deal with. Just as it's illegal for the landlord or the property management or the maintenance staff person to harass a resident, resident-on-resident harassment in housing is also illegal, and there has been an uptick and increase in that. And what a lot of folks don't realize is landlords are legally responsible under federal law for addressing it. So if someone says, my neighbor's making fun of me because of my disability or my sexual orientation, here's what's going on, the landlord can't ignore it. Now, people harass each other in apartments and so on for many reasons, too much noise, but if it has to do with any protected class, the landlord is legally required to investigate and to take action to solve the problem. And this has always been in the fair housing law, but just this last year, HUD put out a new ruling putting landlords on warning that they cannot ignore these claims. And there are consequences, just like with any illegal acts that we're talking about. There are consequences for violating these laws. There are damages, punitive damages, compensatory damages, attorney fees, and so on. But again, you folks may hear about something, and as I said earlier, be the soft cop. Let a landlord know they can't do it. Landlords can call our office and feel safe. We have staff specifically designated to call to them, to talk to them and let them know what they can and can't do. So I'm going to run one more slide here and then do our first check-in to see if anyone has any questions so far. So kind of reiterating the basic ideas of these civil rights laws in housing. People have the right to choose where they live, assuming they're eligible. So if a landlord says, this isn't a good place for kids, it's a busy street, there's not a good place to play, that is not appropriate. It is up to the applicant to decide what unit is there. Or I'm not comfortable dealing with people who have disabilities. No, all of these things are illegal. Now that assumes the person is eligible to live there, that they meet the criteria. And really important, there's an exception we'll talk about later, but in general, the landlords, any housing providers, adult foster care homes, whatever it is, do need to be consistent. How they treat applicants. You know, they're going to rent to the first person who meets their consistent requirements. The rules they have, the privileges in an apartment community or, you know, mobile park or whatever it is, same consequences for violating the rules. And focusing on behavior, not assumptions. If I rent to you and I have this disability, I think this is going to happen. Or if I rent to you and I know you've been a survivor of domestic violence, which falls under gender discrimination, I know your ex will show up. These are all assumptions. Landlords need to just go by the facts. So, for example, I spoke with a landlord a while back who had rented to a family from Somalia. The family brought in a lot of relatives, and there were way too many people for the occupancy limits in that unit. So their tenancy was terminated, which was legal. But then the landlord said, I am not renting to anyone from Somalia ever again. And that's illegal. It's based on assumptions because of these other folks. Or we had a case in southeast Portland where they had a family with teenagers who caused a lot of problems, and they said no more families with teenagers, which falls under families with children discrimination. So anyway, that's your first phase here. So I'd like to check back with you all and see if any of you have any questions so far.
Thanks, Diane. This is awesome. I'm looking to see, does anybody have questions? I know we had a couple earlier. Hopefully you guys were able to get hold of Lori at lori.c.watt@state.or.us and get your PowerPoint. Do we have any new questions? I'm not seeing anything up here.
I suspect most of them will be when we really get into disability issues, but
yeah.
I do want to stop along the way.
I did want to double check, Diane. I wrote down a couple of notes here, and I don't know if Christy did or not, but I wanted to double check. And these things that you're talking about, you guys work statewide. So even our folks from over in Ontario or LeGrand or Pendleton or Bend or South Coast, they can all call you with any issues like this, if they come up with any, right?
Yes, we will be showing our toll-free number and our email information, and we periodically go out to your areas too. I mean, we're a small office and it's a big state, but we can follow up with you and take your information and let me know when we're going to be in an area next to meet with you or whatever. But yes, we serve the entire state.
I also heard you talking about looking at ads that were discriminatory. So you guys, as you read your local newspapers, if you see an ad that looks discriminatory to you, I would forward it to these guys.
Yeah.
You know, scan it and send it in an email or send it, you know, hard copy or whatever.
And that would be great. And the thing about these ads is obviously if we see an ad that says whites only, well, hopefully we won't ever see that. That's very obvious. But sometimes an ad has something like a chilling effect. So if there's an ad that says this apartment would be ideal for a young couple, they're not saying no children, but it's going to have a chilling effect on families with children. Or we're looking for active independent seniors. They're not saying we won't take people with disabilities. They should be describing the property and not the type of people they want to live there.
So we have a question. Do you have materials that they can access or print out or a website? Or I see a pile of brochures they brought for Christy and I, and we can make sure we send some out to you guys, and maybe they have some online that you can get to too.
We do have information online on our website, www.fhco.org, and that will be in your presentation. We can also send you materials for your offices if you contact us. We have brochures in English, Spanish, and other languages. We also have something that's pictographs that shows pictures like, has this happened to you? We have a booklet that we are updating this week for landlords. So if you are talking with somebody's landlord and they are, quote, confused, or they are confused, this is information that you can give them and say, hey, we don't want you to get in trouble. We are happy to send those to you as well. We have all kinds of things. I actually brought brochures because we have a kids poster contest going right now, and some of you, if you're working with kids. So we would be happy. We do have information on our website, but if you want to get hard copies for your office, just contact us. And again, we do travel around the state, and when we're in an area, we can swing by different offices and drop materials off as well.
So is your contact information at the end of the PowerPoint?
Yes, it'll be at the end of the PowerPoint.
The other thing I noted in my notes was that they talked about possibly having these mystery shopper kinds of people. And I was thinking for you guys in the AAAs, or maybe even, I don't know if you guys at the SILs have an advisory council too, but this would be a great thing for your senior advisory councils on your AAAs. To have one of those folks volunteer to be a mystery shopper in your area. And
we actually pay them.
And they actually would get paid for it.
Oh, that's nice.
So that would be a fun thing, and it would be, something great. So yeah, volunteers, or you have a senior advisory council member that wants to do that, that would be a great thing to think
And
about.
those are other brochures we could potentially send you about being a tester. And when we get to the end of the presentation with the email, if folks are interested, they can email us. That's a way to know you're working for social justice. You get a little extra money, and basically you just need to remember what your profile is, because you don't even know if you're a tester what you're testing for, because we don't want, you have no idea if it's race, religion, you don't know. You don't want to bring any bias. So you just, I work here, I do this, I do that, I answer these questions, and I respond. So keep it in mind.
It looks like someone's asking if this training is being offered to ADRC folks, and that's who these webinars are for. So the people on here are ADRC partners from the SILs or the AAAs. We also send it out to the APD offices, to their managers, and we encourage the SILs and the AAAs to send these out to all staff. We also, as we said in the beginning of the webinar, will be recording it and posting it on our website, so it's there for, that's why we do these webinars, so the ADRC folks, the INR staff, and the options counseling folks all can get this information and have it.
So this will be recorded?
Yeah, we're recording this right now, and it'll be posted by next week. We have to take the recording and get it closed captioned before we can post it, and then we'll be posting it. So it probably won't get up till next week. Somebody's saying it's great information. Thank you. We're only partway through. Are there housing protections based on veteran status or previous homelessness?
That's a very good question. In the state of Washington, there are protections on veteran status, but not in Oregon. Obviously, if there's a disability issue, it would fall under disability, but it's just people haven't organized around that, so that hasn't happened. Previous homelessness is not a protected class. Many people, again, have disabilities, so that would be the angle. Good question.
Great question. That came from Ms. Daniel, I think it is. Yeah, here's the question about having the agency information in their lobby. Again, at the end of the PowerPoint is their contact information, and I'm sure their email addresses or their phone numbers. You can contact them. They'll be happy to send you brochures, and they will, again, give the website where you can also get information.
We will give that information. We'd love to have our information in your lobby. And the other thing you can think about is if you think, gee, we'd like to have, kind of maybe a longer, more in-depth training for our staff where we are. That would be another thing to contact us about. I can't guarantee when it'll be. It depends where you are. But we do go all over. And once we know you're interested, when we know we're going to that part of the state, we will contact you to see about arranging a training while we're there.
Oh, that's great. So you guys can talk to them, and they'll, in your area, they'll come and do a staff training. Great. So is there protection based on people's immigration status? These folks, some of these folks from the downtown area work with immigrants and mixed families, who some are documented, some aren't documented.
Okay. So there is not a specific protection on that, but there is a protection against discrimination based on national origin. And I haven't talked about disparate impact yet, but what I'm going to do with this question is I am writing it down, and I'm going to come back to it in just a little bit because it's a big issue. So I promise I'll return to this, and if at the end you feel you didn't get it answered, let us know.
Okay, that looks to me like all the questions for now.
There'll be more opportunities.
So yeah, so we're going to go back into the presentation, and then they'll stop again in just a little bit. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, I have to do this. There you go.
All right, so that was kind of Fair Housing 101, the blatant stuff, which we call, the legal term is disparate treatment. So people are being treated differently because they have a disability or because of the country from or whatever. There's also another legal term called disparate impact. Sometimes there may be a policy that doesn't sound discriminatory, but it may have a discriminatory impact on a particular group, whether it's intentional or non-intentional. So for example, and I love this example, if you've ever met me before, you may have heard it, but so we had a situation in Newport where a landlord would not rent to anyone who worked in a fish cannery. Who knows the reason? Maybe they smelled like fish, maybe he didn't like the owner, we don't know what the reason was. However, what we learned is more than 90% of the folks working at fish canneries in Newport were Latino. So intentional or not, this was a policy that had more of a negative impact on a national origin, okay? So another example like this, let's say there's a large apartment complex, and they say we don't permit tricycles here. They're not mentioning children, and sometimes you do see adults on tricycles, but statistically speaking, the vast majority of tricycle users are young children, so this would fall under familial status. So with disparate treatment cases, we're going to look at behavior. The landlord told the white couple we have 3 units, told the Latino couple we don't have anything. With these situations, we look at statistics. Who's being impacted by this policy, whatever the intention? There was another one kind of like this a couple of years ago where they had a rule in an apartment complex that you'd be fined if you left toys on the balcony. They didn't say you can't leave anything on your balcony, and there's all kinds of junk people put out on their balcony. Any of us might play with toys, but statistically speaking, that's going to have more of an impact on families with children. So that's how this works. Let's say somebody says, well, we're not going to rent to anyone who's a survivor of domestic violence. Because statistically, the majority of survivors of domestic violence, certainly not all, are women, that looks like gender discrimination, okay? So that would be another issue where there's a connection here with protected class. So this is something that when we deal with these situations, again, we're looking at, is this a policy that would have more of an impact on protected class? And I think I'm going to go back to that question that I didn't answer before about immigration status. So immigration status per se is not a protected class, but national origin is. So if someone says, I'm going to give you some examples of what we see. I'm not going to rent to you because you're not a permanent citizen. That's probably going to be disparate impact based on national origin. Even with folks who are undocumented, it is not illegal to rent to them. Now, obviously, there's a lot of stuff swirling right now at the federal level, and we don't know how it's all going to trickle down. But one of the things, for example, we see is where a landlord says, okay, to check your history, to have you as a tenant, I'm going to have your social security number. Sorry, you don't have a social security number, can't deal with it. Well, there are many people, including many people who are in this country legally, that do not have social security numbers. But there are many other ways, such as tax ID numbers. We actually have a handout we can get for folks, or go through, to get it out to you. They list all the different ways that a landlord can find out these things if they don't have a Social Security number. If the landlord says no, has to be a Social Security number, that's a policy that's going to have a disparate impact. People who are from other countries, national origin. So the short answer is, while immigration status is not an official protected class, it ties into national origin. Now, an issue with people who are undocumented, they're protected. One of the challenges is people who are undocumented are afraid to contact us. So what I want to make sure everybody knows is we're not a government agency, we're a nonprofit. If the decision is to file a complaint with HUD, historically HUD has committed to not share any information with ICE. However, I would not, given the political climate we're in, I would not guarantee that, but we will work with someone to strategize what to do for their situation. And it might be there's someone else in the complex who's here legally that we can work with them. So it's going to depend what the situation is. So that's kind of a fluid issue, but in general, there is a national origin protection. And if people are being discriminated against, let's say it's because they're from one of these 7 countries, that's national origin discrimination, and we certainly still are able to enforce that as being illegal under federal laws. So another example of disparate impact, okay, a policy that has more of an impact on a protected class that I want to talk about that's a big issue is criminal history. Perhaps some of you have seen the documentary 13 or read the book The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, but there are incredible statistics about how a much larger percentage of African Americans have felony convictions and have been incarcerated than whites, and also a larger number of Latinos. So what that means is a landlord's policy that says you can't have any criminal history would have more of a negative impact on Latinos, on African Americans. So HUD came out with a ruling last year saying landlords need to look at what they ask for with criminal history. Even if you were in a community where everyone is white and there are no people of color, this is still true. It's true for everyone, but that's the reason behind it, is because these policies had more of an impact on people of color. So again, not every landlord knows this yet, which is why this booklet we have for landlords, this is new. We're actually updating it as we speak. It's just going to the printers today to print more of them. It includes this new criminal history issue. But if landlords say no criminal history to apply for our rentals, that is not legal anymore, okay? They can't refer to arrest records where there's no convictions. They can look at felony convictions, but what they can't say is any felony conviction. They would need to identify felony convictions that would endanger residents or property. The person who asked the question earlier about undocumented folks, I was at a training last week and a gentleman was saying, well, these people who are, these quote illegals who are here, that's a felony, so we don't rent to them because of that. So I kept bringing it back to this. Is that something that would endanger residents or property, unless that person has some other crime in their history? So that's what landlords' criteria needs to look like now. They may not know it yet, but if they're not doing this, it is illegal. So again, you can help us educate landlords. If it's just going on and you want to report it, that's fine too. They need to, they can't just say no criminal history. They need to look at the whole situation, what kinds of crimes, how many offenses, how long ago. And they need to be ready to look at mitigating circumstances. If someone comes to them and says, okay, well, I went through rehab, I have something here from my parole officer, I'm doing great at my job, the landlord would need to consider that information. So this is all new, and there will probably be more information falling into place. HUD is going to give us more information, but at the very least, we're giving you some red flags here of things that are not supposed to be happening anymore.
Say who HUD is in case
people I'm sorry, HUD is the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, and they are very connected with fair housing. They do a lot of the enforcement, and they put out a lot of these rulings. So Just this last year, there was this ruling on criminal history, and the other ruling I mentioned earlier that says landlords have to take responsibility if a resident is harassing another resident based on protected class. So you may be familiar with HUD because they fund housing authorities, or there's HUD-funded properties, but another part of HUD is fair housing and equal opportunity. And that's where a lot of the funding for our nonprofit comes from, by the way, is HUD, and hopefully it will continue to do so. Thanks for the question. So I'm going to be fairly brief on families with kids. There's probably not a lot of folks on this call that are working with families with kids, but I know some of you may be potentially families with children who have disabilities and so on. But I do want to say that probably about 15 to 20% of the situations we deal with are landlords who are discriminating against families with children, which became illegal in 1988. Same as people with disabilities. Those were two protected classes added that year. This is a definition from the law. Basically says where there's one or more folks under 18, whether they're living with their parent, someone else with legal custody, that person's designee, maybe grandma and grandpa raising the kids, maybe it's a foster family, whatever it is, it's protected. And I like that picture with the little turtle. It's not really a turtle. It used to be before 1988, by the way, 70%, this is an amazing statistic that I'm always amazed by, 70% of the rentals were no kids allowed. And that was true here in Oregon, 70%, no children, no pets. And rental agreements would commonly say if a landlord found out a tenant was pregnant, she'd be terminated, she'd be evicted. So that's why where this came from. The only exception is senior housing, if it really is senior housing. So it's illegal to say we don't take kids or toddlers or teenagers, to steer people saying we don't want any kids here or we put all the kids over there, and unreasonable occupancy standards. So for example, to say only one person per bedroom or something like that. We could talk more about that if people have questions. But that has a disparate impact, obviously. So if I say only one person per bedroom, I'm not saying the word kids, but clearly has an impact on families with kids. One of the issues we hear about a lot with families with children are rules that are discriminatory. You can't have different rules for children, and that's true in homeless shelters as well as rentals. You can't say no children allowed or children have to go to bed at 8 or any of these kinds of things any more than you would with any other protected class. No gay people allowed. People on Section 8 have to be in at 8. Same kind of thing with kids. You can't have rules that say no children in the laundry room. You could say no loitering in the laundry room. Rules that are based on behavior. Don't be in the laundry room unless you're doing the laundry. So rules should be based on behavior. Children can't play outside. No toys on the balcony. No tricycles. All of that. Children must be supervised at all times by their parents. Basically, landlords are not supposed to be telling people how to parent. It's fine for them to say tenants are responsible for the behavior of anybody, their kids, their guests, their pets, and so on. So we do hear, especially in the summertime, of unreasonable rules with kids. And again, disparate impact, a complex that says no running anywhere in this community, that's probably going to have more of an impact on kids. They're probably not thinking of this guy with his briefcase trying to get to his bus. And unreasonable safety rules, really that's up to the parents, unless there's a state law that says, if there's a swimming pool, don't be in the pool if you're under 14 without an adult, or weight equipment, manufacturer's instructions. Other than that, that's really up to the parents. And again, this applies to all dwellings. So I want to stop again here, actually, and then we're going to really shift to the balance of our session being on disabilities. But I want to see if anyone has any more questions on what we just talked about.
So based on the new laws regarding criminal history screening, do tenants or prospective tenants have the right to request to see what the landlords are seeing that is regarding their possible criminal history? Like we can't necessarily see what our doctor's saying about us, like the HIPAA rules and things, unless we release that information. Do we have the right to look at what they're looking at?
Well, let me, and Sean may want to add to this too. So if the person who has the criminal history, who's going to the landlord and saying, here's my story, they would be bringing documentation from whoever. Now, if it's because of a disability, which we're going to talk more about, they would probably bring a letter from their doctor that is not getting into the details of their disability, just saying that the disability has caused this behavior, or it's not a problem, or anything else. As for tenants or prospective tenants having the right to see what the landlords are seeing regarding their possible criminal history, do you want to talk about screening companies and what they have to say and what they can't say? This is my colleague, Charles Reuter, who also works with me at the Fair Housing Council, and we'll be talking more later. But Charles, you want to take a stab at this?
Right. So prior to my work with the Fair Housing Council, I taught tenant education for 14 years. So my understanding is that even with these new laws, that a landlord and a screening company don't have to release that background check to the applicant. Now, certainly the applicant can contact the screening company and ask, and maybe the screening company would let the applicant see it, but they're not required by law to do that. What I would suggest, though, is if you're working with somebody who has a criminal history, they don't know what their criminal history says, have them contact the courthouse where the charges took place, and they can pull up a background check, a criminal history check. Now, it does cost money. Be aware if the person does have an open warrant, if they do physically walk into the courthouse, they can be detained for that open warrant. But a person should be able to get their criminal history. And the Oregon and Washington criminal history reporting systems are actually linked. So a person would be able to see their Washington and Oregon report at the same time. That's my understanding.
Actually, I am going to transition this over to Charles now because, as we mentioned earlier, actually about 50% of what we deal with at the Fair Housing Council is disabilities. I guess every 5 Americans has a disability as defined by the Fair Housing Act. This is going to impact many of the folks you work with. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Charles. And one moment, please.
Can you talk about Oregon's tiered system regarding those folks with sex offenses in housing?
So, I mean, again, the landlord is going to be looking at, is this a crime that there's evidence there would be a danger to others or a danger to the property? So somebody who has had a conviction, say, for statutory rape because they were 20 and their girlfriend was 16 and so on, is not someone that's going to be dangerous to others. So I mean, it complements the state, but there's no connection between the two laws. Basically, what the landlord is looking at here is, does this person present a danger? That is the criteria.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. As Diane said, my name is Shail, and prior to my work for the Fair Housing Council, I worked with adults living with HIV and AIDS. So for 14 years, I worked with individuals with disabilities. Oftentimes, they would have other disabilities on top of being HIV positive, and also a lot of times living with addiction issues, mental health issues, dealing with homelessness. So I want to be honest about that because my presentation on disabilities is definitely from a social service and also a housing advocate background. So when we talk about disability, I know a lot of you have probably tried to help people apply for Social Security disability, and their definition of disability seems to be shifting and changing often and is very hard to sort of pin down. So when I talk about disability, we're not talking about that definition. We're talking about the definition that is outlined by the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's the one that Fair Housing Act also uses. So that's any physical or mental condition that substantially impairs a major life activity. And those major life activities would be walking, seeing, hearing, breathing, thinking and learning, and caring for oneself. So the protected class of disability, it also includes an ongoing chronic medical condition. So just to throw some examples out there so you get an idea of what we're talking about here, MS, cerebral palsy, schizophrenia, autism, seizure disorders, asthma, PTSD, ADD, and those are just some examples. There's certainly a lot more than that. And also alcoholism, addiction, it's considered a disability, and people do get special protections, but they need to be in recovery from that addiction. So not current users of illegal substances. They don't get these protections that we're going to talk about around disability. And also a person with a disability, it doesn't mean that they're allowed to violate the rental agreement. So I had somebody in one of my tenant education classes, and he was learning about this protected class of disability. He said, oh, so when I'm mad at my neighbor, I can break their window and then tell the landlord it was because of my mental health disorder, and then it's all fine. And he said, no, that's not how this works. That's certainly not how these laws work. So we had more conversations about how these laws work. Okay, so disability is different from the other protected classes. It means a landlord not treating somebody differently because they're disabled, but it also means that a landlord may need to remove some kind of a barrier that would prevent a person from being able to live in a unit. And that barrier could be a physical barrier, or that barrier could be a policy or a rule or a procedure. And we'll talk more about both of those. So if the barrier is a physical barrier, the person with a disability can ask for what's called a reasonable modification. So that means to modify the unit so they're able to live there with their disability. So some examples of modifications could be a ramp put in for somebody who's got a wheelchair. It could be grab bars put in the shower for somebody who's got some mobility issues, adapted bathrooms, adapted kitchens. Now let's talk about who has to pay for these modifications. If the unit is run by, say, a housing authority, it gets federal funds in that sense, then it is the landlord's responsibility to pay for the modification to occur. Now, if it's a private landlord, then it's the tenant that is responsible for paying for that change. And upon move out, the landlord can also require the tenant to change it back to what it had been before. Now, if the modification is made in some type of a public area and it makes the whole complex, say, more accessible, like putting handrails in upstairs, then the landlord cannot require the tenant to change it back. Oftentimes, what I also found when I was working with individuals with disabilities, that if they would ask landlords for things like, a handrail put into stairways, even if it was inside their unit, smaller things like that, oftentimes landlords were willing to go ahead and do, even if it was private housing, because it made the unit more safe, more accessible. But that's not always the case, but I want you to know some landlords are willing to negotiate around that. Now, let's talk about reasonable accommodations. This is what I ended up working with a lot more when I was working with individuals with disabilities. So reasonable accommodation means asking for an exception or a shift to a policy or a rule or a procedure. And it's a policy, rule, or procedure that if it's not shifted or made an exception to, that it would prevent the person from being able to live there or stay stable there. So some common examples of these reasonable accommodations. So parking spots. Maybe somebody has a physical disability that makes it really difficult for them to walk long distances, say from their car into their apartment unit. Even if the landlord doesn't normally assign a parking spot, they could request it because of their disability. Assistance animals. This is a very common one. And in fair housing, when we say assistance animals, we mean service animals and also companion animals. And I'm going to talk more about assistance animals in a little bit. Caregivers, that's a very common reasonable accommodation. Caregivers are not considered a tenant. They're not somebody that would get put on the lease agreement. However, a person may need a caregiver to be able to stay stable in housing. The landlord is allowed to run a criminal history check on that caregiver. They're absolutely allowed to figure out if that person would be a danger to other people on the property. But as far as running a full background check, like eviction history, credit history, rental history, that's not something that the landlord's allowed to do because, again, the person is a medical tool, basically, like a wheelchair would be a medical tool for someone with a disability in housing. Special arrangements, so around like maybe late rent. So I've got a couple of examples of this. One example is maybe an individual has a disability to do with memory issues, like have a problem remembering things that's directly related to their disability. They could ask the landlord something like, if I forget to pay my rent, would you remind me by the 3rd? Certainly very common. I also used to work with a gentleman who got his income from Social Security disability, and it came on the 10th of every month, which was after the due date for the rent. So he was able to ask for a reasonable accommodation that his rent be due later in the month, and it was specifically because his income was directly related to his disability, and the landlord was able to work with him on that. So with landlords, all the requests that are made around reasonable accommodations and modifications, they have to be considered, but they have to be reasonable. So let's talk about what reasonable is, because certainly what's reasonable to Sue Ann might be different than what's reasonable to me. So there's a process that landlords are supposed to go through when they're figuring out if something is reasonable or not. Now, it doesn't mean that the landlord gets to second guess the doctor, the resident's doctor or therapist that is, writing the verification letter saying that the person needs an accommodation for their disability. Doesn't mean that the landlord gets to say, oh, the person doesn't seem disabled or look disabled. That's not what this means. But it does have to do with how is it going to impact the housing provider. So when they are considering reasonable accommodation requests, they really have to go through sort of 4 different steps to figure out, is it reasonable or is it not reasonable? So to be reasonable, it shouldn't be too costly. Okay, so for example, let's say I have a mobility disability and I live up on the 3rd floor, and I tell the landlord I need a reasonable modification to have an elevator installed. Certainly that could end up being too costly for the landlord to do. Now, ideally, if I'm turning in some kind of a request for a reasonable accommodation or modification, if the landlord can't grant it, ideally it begins the conversation, and the landlord can maybe start negotiating with the tenant about what might actually work for them. So this is sort of the first step in the conversation that can happen. If it's an undue burden, a landlord can turn down a reasonable accommodation request or modification request. Also, maybe it's not a fundamental part of the landlord's job description, so maybe an individual has a hard time cooking for themselves because of the disability. They could turn in a reasonable accommodation request to say, landlord, I want you to invite me over every night and cook me dinner. Certainly not part of the landlord's job description. They could turn that down. And then also, it can't be a direct threat to other residents of the property. So I can't have my companion transformer on the property because it makes me feel more safe, especially if the transformer has been known to hurt other people. So, okay. So let's talk a little bit more about assistance animals. Now, the dog that's on the top of this picture, I really like this dog. Its name is Renee. It lives in the UK. Its owner has cerebral palsy, and so this dog has been trained to put the ATM card inside the ATM, pull the money out of the ATM, and pull the card out of the ATM. Now, Renee is not good enough yet to put in, the code and the money amount in the ATM, but these assistance animals can do all sorts of things. So, for example, can help people with balance, can help people with fetching things, can detect when blood sugars are going out of the correct levels, can detect seizures, migraines in individuals, can help reduce anxiety, help reduce depression, which certainly both of those things can affect if somebody's going to be stable in housing or not, can help lower blood pressure, help people regulate heart rate, help individuals with autism and ADD as well. So lots of different things that these animals can do. So more on assistance animals. So again, when we say assistance animal in fair housing, this is an umbrella term that we're using that includes certified service animals and also companion animals. So if you've got questions about service animals out in the community and public accommodations, that's separate from what we're talking about. We're talking about animals specifically in housing. And something else I also want to say about assistance animals is oftentimes when I was working in that housing program, I would hear people say terms like assistance pets, therapy pets, companion pets. And you want to really stay away from that term. We suggest using the term assistance animals because once you start sticking in the word pet, then it really weakens the case for this is a medical tool that somebody needs to stay stable in housing. So we really recommend the word assistance animals. So somebody with a disability can actually have more than one assistance animal. Certainly can have more than one assistance animal, but there needs to be a purpose for each animal. So for example, maybe I have 2 companions, dogs in the household, one of them, or 2 assistance animals in the household. Maybe one is for me because I struggle with depression, and maybe one is a service animal because my child has autism. So there can be more than one animal, but certainly a landlord is allowed to verify with whoever is providing medical verification that I need this reasonable accommodation. So for example, a doctor has written a verification letter that I need an assistance animal, and then the landlord finds out that I have moved 9 chinchillas into the apartment. Okay, probably excessive, and the landlord is allowed to contact the provider to find out, did you mean 9 chinchillas, right? So it's not that the landlord can be asking questions necessarily about the disability, but the landlord can verify the nature of the accommodation and if it's what they meant by, verifying the need for that. Also, let's talk about weight and breed restrictions. There's a lot of questions about this. So people will ask oftentimes, well, what if the landlord says, no animals, no pets above 20 pounds? Remember, again, this is not a pet. This is an assistance animal. So normal weight restrictions and breed restrictions on pets do not apply for assistance animals. Sometimes landlords will say things like, well, my insurance company won't cover that specific animal or that specific breed. But remember, insurers are also legally responsible to follow these laws. Now, one of the things that we've heard about is that oftentimes with the insurance company, when landlords call to verify this, it's not usually the first person that answers the phone that understands these, the fair housing laws around assistance animals. Oftentimes it's the person above them or somebody above them. But ultimately, we've usually been able to get to someone that understands these protections. Now, certainly, if an animal has a history of being violent or dangerous, the landlord is allowed to turn that animal down. So let's say like it's, Bosco, the 10-pound Chihuahua, but Bosco is known for biting everybody. The landlord can say, no, absolutely not. But let's say it's Fluffy, the 100-pound Rottweiler, and Fluffy has no history of ever causing damage or being violent, so the landlord can't turn it down just because of size or breed. The landlord is allowed to ask that the animal is vaccinated and licensed. Also, the landlord is allowed to ask that somebody fills out an assistance animal agreement. Now, something else, too, is that landlords are not allowed to charge fees or deposits for assistance animals, and they're also not allowed to charge pet rent, because remember, again, this is not a pet. So let's talk about the request itself, the reasonable accommodation request, how this happens. It's initiated by the resident. So this process is started by the resident. And it can occur at any time within this process. And when it's initiated by the resident, we suggest that people create a paper trail. So when they're initiating this process, do it in writing. It's a really great idea. Also, if somebody ever feels that they're being discriminated against, it's a great idea to start creating a written log. What happened, what time, who was involved, what was said. So creating this paper trail. So certainly with reasonable accommodation, have a paper trail. Put the request in writing. Also verification letters that you're getting from providers, who verify the need for this request. Keep copies in writing. So let's talk about these reasonable accommodation requests and what they can look like. So they can happen around during the application process around rental history, credit history, criminal history. And these requests need to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. So an example of something that could happen around rental history. Maybe somebody has a criminal history charge. It's directly related to an undiagnosed mental health issue. Since that time, they've never had a relapse of that behavior. They could get a letter from their mental health provider saying that they're adhering to treatment and that they're stable in care, and the landlord has to take that into consideration and possibly overlook that rental history problem or that criminal history problem. I know a lot of folks that I worked with that had been diagnosed early on in the epidemic with HIV, figured that they were going to die quickly, destroyed their credit completely, and then guess what? Good meds came out. They had a hard time finding a landlord because they destroyed their credit. So we are allowed to ask the landlord to overlook the bad credit history that was related to that disability. Certainly we wanted to show, and you always do want to be able to show, that something has stabilized since that time, because remember, they still have to be able to follow the lease agreement. So these reasonable accommodation requests, the landlord has to look at them on a case-by-case basis. The applicant should be otherwise eligible. We suggest bringing reference letters, and if it's say like it's something around criminal history, it might be a really good idea to bring more than one reference letter. So if the criminal history is related to somebody's addiction and the person's now in recovery, it might be a good idea for that person to bring their treatment certificate, a letter from their drug and alcohol counselor, maybe a letter from their sponsor, you know, maybe a letter if they've been working and been stable in their job for a year, even a letter from their employer saying that helps to verify that they're in a more stable place now and they can follow a lease agreement. And of course, the applicant can still be turned down if they're a danger to others as well. This is a really great opportunity for you also to help role play and prepare with clients. Clients can be really afraid around this process and, oh, I don't want to tell the landlord about what's on the background check, or, you know, there can be a lot of shame wrapped up in this. Once they understand how these laws work and these protections work, it gets easier to be able to start talking about their story. And the reality is, if the landlord is going to pull up this information anyways, it's best for the applicant to be upfront and honest that it's there and be able to show what they've done right up front. That's what's advisable. And especially with vacancy rates being so low, it's also advisable to turn in these reasonable accommodation requests with the application. Now let's talk a little bit about survivors of domestic violence. We're going to circle back to that. So applicants who are domestic violence victims and are survivors of that are also allowed to ask for exceptions to application requirements. So this process ends up looking a lot like that reasonable accommodation. So again, we suggest putting it in writing, and also, you know, the landlord's allowed to ask them to verify that there's a restraining order or a police report or a qualified third party that worked with the person who was involved in the domestic violence situation, and also the person wants to be able to say that, you know, the abuser is no longer in the situation. So when I worked with somebody around this, I worked with a woman who had a recent criminal history charge on her records because her abuser was using her computer for identity theft. So when the police came to the door, arrested them both because it was her computer. He ended up in prison because it was his actions, but it was still her computer. So we ended up asking the landlord, kind of like in a reasonable accommodation situation, we asked the landlord to overlook that criminal history, and because it was directly related to the fact that she was a survivor of domestic violence. And then we also had several letters included from social service workers, from a court advocate who had worked with her during that time to verify she was a survivor. And she got into a place, and she's still stable to this day, and that was 10 years ago, so that's great news. Yeah. So residents can also ask for these reasonable accommodation requests after they receive a termination notice. So maybe there's an issue with noise. So maybe a person has some kind of a mental health disorder which is causing them to make a lot of noise after quiet hours. They can certainly ask for a reasonable accommodation around that disability, and the landlord may need to work with them around more of a modification to do some soundproofing or something like that. But they can certainly ask for that if they've received a termination notice. Also around people who hoard. This is a really common problem. More and more we see this, and hoarding is considered an obsessive-compulsive disorder. It's in the DSM-5. Certainly if a landlord has a resident who is hoarding, they are allowed to give them a termination notice. Usually what I've been hearing about is the landlord giving a 30-day termination notice with the 14 days to remedy. The person then is allowed to turn in a reasonable accommodation or request to say, hey, I have a disability, and this is what I'm going to do to deal with the hoarding problem. And that begins the conversation with the landlord. Harassment also. So if somebody is harassing other residents, maybe this is around somebody has a mental health disorder and they've changed medications and they've been decompensating as a result of changing those medications. Hopefully they have like a caseworker that's working with them or something who can maybe step in and help them with a reasonable accommodation request to say, I need a reasonable accommodation request, this is what's going on, we're working on stabilizing the situation. Okay. So let's talk about how these fair housing laws get enforced. So most commonly we get contacted first And it's really suggestible if somebody's wondering, is this a fair housing concern? Is this connected to discrimination based on protected class? Or maybe this is just landlord-tenant law? You can always call our hotline to find out. We're happy to be a resource. If we're not the right resource, we try to refer to other resources that might work. We get more than 2,000 calls a year. Of those 2,000 calls, 10% are actually related to fair housing issues. 70% of the time, we're able to resolve those through advocacy. So that's a really high rate of being able to resolve them without having to escalate. So our hope is really to try to solve the problem as quickly as possible. It's also dependent upon what the person wants that's calling in. In certain cases, we can assist the client in filing complaints as well. And with that, if we're filing a complaint, next comes the investigation. And what happens is we have to try to figure out, did the discrimination occur? This is really, this is where having a paper trail makes it a lot easier, right? So if we have some kind of a paper trail, it's easier to figure out if discrimination possibly occurred or not. I will also say this, that somebody has up to 1 year to report a Fair Housing Discrimination Act to us as the Fair Housing Council from the date it occurred, or up to 2 years to report it to HUD, so Housing and Urban Development. If they're outside the 1 year window, we can certainly help and give the information for how to file it with HUD as well. But I know a lot of times when people are experiencing housing discrimination, it might not be the right time for them to try to deal with it. Sometimes they just feel they need to get out of the unit where it's occurring, and then afterwards they can come back and deal with it when they're in a more stable place. And then we certainly have investigation tools. So investigation tools like the testers that we send out. So we send out testers, our testers also call. So all those sorts of things. And then we have to figure out, is it a dwelling? Is it actually considered a dwelling? Is it where a person lives? Now, unfortunately, if somebody is living in a tent or living in a car, those are not considered dwelling, even though oftentimes we know that that is where the person is living. But it's not a dwelling under fair housing law. So it's a more specific definition for fair housing, what a dwelling is. And then enforcers of these laws can include BOLI, HUD, the State Attorney General's Office, U.S. Department of Justice, and or an attorney. And then outcomes can really vary. So it could be that we assist somebody with advocating. It could be that the person no longer lives with the landlord, but we hear about a problem, and then we send out testers, or it could be that it escalates into the court system. Sometimes those cases will settle beforehand. Sometimes they end up in court as well. It's very situation dependent. So as Diane said earlier, only 1 in 10 discriminatory acts ends up getting reported. And why this is ignorance of fair housing rights. I was at an event, I was staffing an information table, and I had a woman come up to the table and say, gosh, I really wish I would have known what these laws were 3 years ago. I had a landlord that said he didn't even want to see my children playing through the living room window. I know what these laws are now, and I certainly would stand up for myself now, but at the time I didn't. So part of what you can do is help us get this information out to the people that you're serving, because a lot of people that you're serving may feel very disempowered, and it's important for them to know what their rights are under these fair housing laws. People oftentimes are afraid of landlord retaliation, and that's a very real thing, especially with a vacancy rate so low and people who are living on limited incomes. So it's a very good idea that if somebody is feeling that they're being discriminated against, to, again, start contacting us, start working with us. This can be a really big issue also in smaller communities where the landlords all seem to know each other, so maybe they don't keep lists of, tenants who are, quote unquote problem tenants, but they may talk to each other, and so somebody has a reputation in the community, and that can make it a lot harder for them to find another place. An individual, again, can file a complaint up to 2 years after moving. That's a 2-year statute of limitation. Some people are afraid of being reported to the landlord, so after calling us, maybe they're afraid that we're going to end up calling the landlord and telling the landlord what happened. We don't report that to the landlord. We certainly don't talk to the landlord, of course, unless the person who's calling us is interested in going that route and it's a fair housing claim. So we have confidentiality that we follow, and so we want people to know that. Also, I'd like to say that the staff, the people that staff the hotline are very well trained in how to work with people that also have dealt with trauma in their life. When I was working at Cascade AIDS Project and I had some individuals with some very difficult life circumstances, they were always treated amazingly respectfully whenever we had to call the hotline because of the fair housing concern. So I want your folks to be aware of that. So again, sometimes people never report because there's other priorities or crises that they need to attend to. And what you can do is really help keep an eye out for red flags that people are dealing with. And also share information with landlords too. We can be a resource for landlords as well. So if landlords are wondering if something, a housing violation, a fair housing violation, is it not, certainly they can end up calling us. We also, again, have that new Landlord's Fair Housing Guide, and we're happy to help get that information out to your agencies if you think that you can use it while you're working with placing clients in housing. So let's talk about getting help. So here's the 1-800 number that we talked about. So getting help, contact us at the hotline. Our hotline is currently open Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays, 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock. Extension 2 for English, extension 6 for Spanish. And people can also, if emailing is easier, maybe it's not the easiest to call us during those limited hours, you can certainly email us, information@fhco.org. If you're also interested in getting some of our printed materials, use this email address, information@fhco.org, because we can respond to your request and get that information out to you. If you, again, are interested in maybe seeing if we could come do a training at your agency or in your community, this is also the email that you would want to use for that as well. And then our website, if you're wanting to go to our website and just see what resources and tools we have online, here's our website, www.fhco.org. So, again, let us know if you want brochures in your office. We're happy to get those to you. And I believe now we are going to open it up for questions.
And we have some. Let's see. Are tenants with requirements for assistance animals required to pay the same pet rent and pet deposit as other folks?
That's a great question. And remember, the assistance animal is not considered a pet. They're considered a tool for somebody's disability. So no pet rent, no pet deposits. Certainly if that assistance animal damages the unit, the tenant is required to pay for that, and that money usually comes out of the security deposit.
And can you please clarify who makes the determination that the animal is an assistance animal? Is it a medical person, mental health professional?
So it's going to be any professional that is working with that person around disability, and usually who it ends up being is it ends up being like a licensed social worker, it ends up being a mental health professional, it ends up being a doctor, a nurse practitioner. Those are the most common places that we see those assistance animals letters come from.
And then would you please repeat the hotline hours?
Absolutely, happy to. So the hotline is open Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday. Again, open Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday from 1 to 4 o'clock. So 1 to 4 o'clock, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday. Now, there's not a message on those phone lines, so they are only open during those 3-hour periods, Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, and that's why we have that email address also. So if you want to reach out, get some information when it's not hotline hours, please email us at information@fhco.org.
I'm not seeing any other questions. Oh, we got one from Mary Jo, snuck one in. Can you clarify what was mentioned earlier about not using criminal arrest information?
Yeah, I'll pass this back to Diane since Diane has spoken about this.
And this one, and then she says also, does that include only arrests or convictions?
Okay. So there's a HUD ruling, by the way. If you want to Google it and read the actual ruling from HUD, you can. It's pretty easy to do and just put HUD ruling on criminal history. But basically, they're not supposed to have global requirements on criminal history. They are not supposed to look at arrests, only felony convictions, and they're supposed to look at, is this something that would be dangerous to others on the property, to others living on the property or to the property. They would look at how far back they go, how many years, how many times. So they need to have criteria of what they're going to look for. They can't say no criminal history. They can't say no arrest, and they have to identify all of these things. Even after they do that, somebody could come back to them, kind of like the disability process that Shyle talked about, and say, well, I want you to consider this other information. I have some information here from my old parole officer, my employer, the person. I was in for issues related to addiction or whatever, basically to show this is not me. I've turned my life around, and the prospective landlord would need to consider it. So here's what this all means with you. If somebody has all their ducks in order and they're turned down, and it sounds like this landlord is not doing this, they should call us. That's really the bottom line with this. These are red flags, and obviously it's going to be complicated. It's going to be case by case. There's still details coming down from HUD. But in any of these situations, you think, well, you know, for example, they turned down this person because of the criminal history. It doesn't look like it was that bad. Or they turned this person down. They had problems in the past because of their disability, but they can show that's not an issue anymore. It was because of a disability, and now they, they've been through treatment or whatever, and the landlord blows them off. That sounds like a fair housing issue. And, under fair housing law, that would be looked at just like the landlord who said whites only. All of these are kind of equivalent. So it can get to be case by case and murky, but again, the point here is looking for red flags. So if the prospective landlord says, well, you were arrested a couple of times, I'm not going to rent to you, well, that's clearly something we would want to hear about. And this is all fair housing law, not Oregon landlord-tenant law.
And so there's a comment up there that says that, so Mary Jo is saying that she can't find it in the new landlord guide that's on our website, and you are totally correct. It is not in our new landlord guide right now because we're currently revamping that, and we should have the new one done by later next week, and so hopefully within the next few weeks we'll have that uploaded onto our website. So kind of a couple different things you can do, maybe hold off a couple weeks, or if you are interested in signing up for our newsletter, we put a newsletter out 4 to 6 times a year. We do it on email. We do not share people's email addresses or sell those, but if you're interested in signing up for our fair housing emails that we do, the information newsletter, so email us if you want to sign up for that at information@fhco.org, and we can get you signed up for that. That's also really helpful with the new information we're going to have coming out that further clarifies the criminal history stuff. So definitely sign up for that if that's something that you think would be useful to you.
Yeah, and as we speak today, we are sending the new landlord guide out to the printer with the criminal history. So it will, in the next few weeks, you will have a version that does include that, because this is all new. We've still been sorting through it. We're still trying to figure it out. So again, that's where it all comes back to the red flags. Even if you hear something and you think, well, I don't know, maybe could this be something? Bottom line, 1 in every 10 of these acts is ever reported. So we want to have our hotline folks have the opportunity to go through that.
Awesome. So I'm not. Oh, somebody just popped one in here. Okay. So this is a very particular question about a specific client. A consumer who has received a no-cause eviction. She has a seizure disorder disability, living in her apartment for the past 17 years. It looks well kept. They did a secret shopper inquiry, and the apartment complex where she lives will have an apartment available soon. Is there anything they can do to help her stay in her apartment or stay located in the same complex? Her seizure episodes are increasing because of this situation.
Okay, so so she's gotten a so the reason she got the no-cause eviction was because of her having the seizures?
So it sounds to me, and I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, is Zara or Zaira, but it sounds like maybe you need to call these guys directly because this is a specific.
Call the hotline.
So call the hotline, during the hours that they told you it's open, or shoot an email at the information email address, and they will get with you and talk with you specifically about your situation.
And it would be good to know when you do that, if you or she has any ideas as to why what the real reason is behind that no cause notice. Is it because the landlord's aware that she's had seizures, or what she thinks is going on with that?
Yeah, these are exactly the kind of scenarios that we had these guys come on so that you can call them, and now you know you have a resource to talk to about this. And we are so excited to have had them here. Oh, perfect. Okay, good. So you are gonna, it's one of your coworkers, and you're gonna forward the information. Perfect. Thank you. So yeah, Christy and I have been so excited, and we've just been like nodding our heads. This information is so amazing. I'm so glad we recorded the webinar, and thank you so much, Diane and Shail, for being here today. This was just great. Make sure you guys send them information, the information email address, and they'll send you brochures. They also brought some, which I'm going to stick in my training box, so as I'm out and about with seeing all you guys, I'll have this information for you too as we come out in the spring. It's just been an amazing time to have you guys here, and this information is so helpful. We really appreciate it. I'm not seeing any more questions. I want to remind you guys that are on the webinar that you will get an email shortly with a Survey Monkey. It's very quick. Please take just a couple minutes and fill it out. It'll come from Lori Watts. But please fill out the Survey Monkey, and then we'll know how we did today. Also, please send me any ideas you have for topics or speakers you'd like to hear more about, because we schedule one webinar a month. And I'm always open to other ideas besides those of mine and my team. Thanks again so much. We really appreciate everybody being here, and I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar as I'm not seeing any more questions. Thanks, everybody, and have a great afternoon.